Yes.
Okay, please, go to one microphone.
Lui dà gli ordini.
Take a microphone. Take a microphone, please.
About the Orthodox Church.
Ich war mehrmals in Moskau und habe mit der orthodoxen Kirche auch zu tun gehabt. Und ich habe bemerkt, dass man in Russland sagt, die römisch-katholische Kirche ist eine italienische Angelegenheit.
The Roman Catholic Church is an Italian product.
Und man soll sich damit nicht einlassen. Und wenn man Näheres erwartet, dann erwartet die russische orthodoxe Kirche, auch vom Patriarchen Kirill, dass die gegründeten römisch-katholischen Diözesen in der Republik Russland rückgebildet werden in apostolische Administrationen. Bitte zu übersetzt.
They say that the diocese is created in the former Soviet Union by the Catholic Church. There were 4 dioceses. Should be diminished and become again administrations. Well, I don't know what is the point.
Ja. Und es ist traurig auch die Einstellung, dass man der katholischen Kirche nicht die Absicht hat, das zurückzugeben, was man ihr weggenommen hat vorher.
But the Catholic Church is not ready to give back what she took before to others.
Ja, und es ist interessant, und das habe ich auch hier bei der Plenartagung erwähnt, dass es mir jedes Mal auffällt, weil ich laufend auch die Audienz lese, die Listen des Papstes Franziskus lese, dass der außenpolitische Referent des Patriarchen Kirill, der Hilarion, der ja, aber ich sage es noch einmal, damit er es hört. Und ich möchte sagen, es ist erstaunlich, dass der Hilarion laufend vom Papst Franziskus in Privataudienz empfangen wird und daneben seine Musikstücke im Vatikan aufgeführt werden, ohne dass hier ein Fortschritt in der Ökumene mit der russisch-orthodoxen Kirche zustande kommt.
Okay, this is a very interesting comment. So, you have other questions?
What I was asking before, but should I go ahead or do you? I'll come out. I'll go after. Yeah. Let me know when my turn comes.
No, I have a question for Danny Roderick, because this is a general discussion, so I carry. Now, Danny, in your representation of the political trilemma, you use the triangle. Whereas I completely understand the 2 sides, which you denominated golden straitjacket and Bretton Woods, I have some difficulties in understanding the feasibility of the 3rd side of the triangle, what you call the global governance regime. In other words, these regimes implies hyper-globalization and democratic rule, forgetting about national. But how is it possible? Because you see, hyper-globalization includes not only capital and goods, but above all labor. So how can you make compatible an hyper-globalization regime with a democrat, unless you interpret democracy in the minimal sense of electoral democracy. But if you consider liberal democracy, that is not feasible because people will react and they will not accept the hyper-globalization. Thank you.
That suggests that certainly for today and for the world as a whole, that possible combination is not quite feasible. Now, there was some thinking among various international relations scholars prior to the global financial crisis that in fact there were new modes of governance being created globally, networks, for example, governance by networks, that were creating sort of functional equivalents of certain kinds of democratic accountability that out of which would arise sort of a kind of global governance which on the one hand formulates the rules for global markets, on the other hand retains a certain degree of accountability and responsiveness to local electorates. Now, all of that, of course, as you suggest, did not even consider labor mobility, where in fact these issues become much harder. So if, but it seems even without adding the labor mobility into the picture, I think the only way you could have a hyper-globalization and democratic accountability without significant role for the nation state is the kind of world that you envisaged in your previous comment, which was that in fact the differences across the constituent units in terms of their institutional preferences and legal systems and regulatory approaches became so similar or converged to such a degree that you could have a kind of a system of subsidiarity, as we discussed, where some version of the United States emerges, where you have fair degree of local autonomy in terms of perhaps over policies of education, perhaps public parks or other domains, but monetary fiscal policy, the legal regime, and the regulations of markets is largely federalized. That to some extent also would have been was, I think, the goal of the original architects of the European Commission or the European Union, that they always envisaged that ultimately there was going to be a political integration, that integrating markets and functional integration was a stepping stone ultimately to that. Now, I don't know if the enlargement of the European Union and economic integration having run so much further ahead than institutional integration has made this impossible or not. But I think the fundamental concern is valid, and there's a reason why, even in the context of the European Union, we find that very difficult to envisage that.
I want also to ask to Professor Rodrik something. Do you don't think that we need to make a distinction between the goods that are common goods, water, energy, and this kind of good, and the goods that are goods for the nations, belong more to the nations? So, because in the contrary, it's not all the same, so don't think I...
No, I think that's a very good point, and I think there are some domains where we can really talk about regional or global public goods, and where there has to be clear intergovernmental cooperation, coordination, and to some extent nation states have to give to those global regimes of regulation. The clearest area is obviously climate change, which we talked about earlier. That's a archetypal case of a global public good. It doesn't, from their narrow national interest, no country wants to invest in carbon control. No country wants to invest in the costs of reducing emissions because that's, we have one climate change and it doesn't matter where the CO2 is coming from. So that's the archetypal case, and there might be some other cases like that. Health pandemics, for example, where sort of health risks easily cross border. These are global problems, and they need global governance regimes, and the nation states have to play the game. I think in most economic domains, I think we too easily extend this logic and think about, let's say, the global economy as a global public good as well. But that's a faulty logic, because the reason that we economists teach countries ought to maintain reasonably open borders to goods, capital, and even people is because it's their own national interest if they can redistribute the gains appropriately within their own national borders. So those are, with respect to international trade, international money, with respect to macroeconomic stability, with respect to tax policies, a lot of things that we're actually negotiating internationally are things that if countries were pursuing their national interests with appropriate domestic institutions, they would do the right things from the perspective of the global economy. That's to some extent is my interpretation of the Bretton Woods regime, which experienced significant globalization, even though countries were fairly free to act on their own. That you got a lot of globalization out of a system of countries actually doing what was good for their own because they realized it was in their interest to open up, and they did gradually. So you're right in a number of domains, in climate and health, possibly, arms sales, and those would be, I would add as a third, possibly the area of global cooperation in the area of wealth taxation. That's very easy for, but in sort of the bread and butter issues of international trade, international finance that form the core of economic globalization, I'd argue we're not talking about global public goods.
For example, the Pope is very concerned about the new form of slaves, the forced labor,
Yes.
Prostitution,
Yes.
forced
Yes.
prostitution.
Yes. Yes, and there are certainly certain areas which become where it's appropriate to think about global norms. We can talk about sort of, global norms with respect to basic treatment of labor and human rights, and those are appropriately, I think, global norms. And that would be an argument for bringing some of those basic labor rights that are already in the ILO into the trade regime, for example. And sometimes I say that globalization would look very differently if it was the, UNICEF and ILO that were running the show instead of the WTO and the IMF and the OECD. So who sets the agenda gets to determine how we think what are global problems as opposed to not.
Actually, I had a question for Professor Zubov, but he's not in the room. Did I hear you correctly, Professor Hossel, when you mentioned that Putin put a gorilla in the White House? Because I will speak as an anthropologist with a PhD who studied the quiet grace and the beauty of the gentle beauty of the great apes. And I'm very concerned with this insult to the great apes. And a correction, it's more the orangutan with the orange pigmentation that would be the appropriate reference for further comments along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. I will come back to our colleague, Roderick. I would say I could agree with all you mentioned. It's difficult to discuss that point. The question is, what I would like to ask myself is, where is the responsibility? I mean, I consider quite unjust to say Adam Smith, because their structure of the economic way of thinking bring us into that problem that we have today of incompatibilities or the dry dilemma question you presented quite satisfactory. I should be one of the few that in Spain, my country, are still thinking in Adam Smith philosophically, and I consider a model valid at the 18th century. I mean, Adam Smith doesn't make futurologists. They are considering the initial of the Industrial Revolution first. We are now in the 4th Industrial Revolution, and you cannot take the structure of the way of thinking in the 18th century as to make responsible of what is happening today on disadjustment, imbalances, and problems. You mentioned that liberals come back to a position. This is the younger generation. I am sure, most of them never read Adam Smith. Even they consider themselves Austrians, but never read Menger. They are just the enthusiastic children of Rothbard. And this is the problem with them, because they try to refuse anything that today is happening because of with state intervention, and then we just put a cross in the state, and the state takes their hands off. The question is, they use an argument that we need to justify, say, okay, today all these things, the general equilibriums will not succeed because we are in a market that cannot rationalize, that cannot be efficient in resources allocation, etc., etc. But the question is that we are already more than 1 century, the Sherman law in the United States, the antitrust laws in general, and we are talking today about oligopolies as a system for market today. Never exists today, the free competition. And then can we make responsible from this to the freedom, I mean, to the free model of Adam Smith, or we shall make responsible to the capitalism as a real system with an evolution accelerating the problems at this moment. This is what I like to share with you, because in Spain is very clear. 80% Keynesians, and 40, from the 20 of the rest should be 1.5, thinking in the old system, considering that the Adam Smith in the 5th book of the Wealth of Nations clearly determines a state that must intervene in order to assure education, in order to assure defense, the dignity of the prince, whatever, okay? On the justice, all these matters. But the new generation, all the rest of the 18% more or less, they consider that we have failed today. It's the new system of intervention, starting by, not so much by Keynes, I would say by the Keynesians, more than Keynes. Because I remember Keynes was I think in 29, in that publication in New Republic, that they say state should not make the things that individuals can do it, and do it a bit better or a bit worse, but to do those things that are not doing at all. This principle, typical from John Maynard Keynes, this is not followed by the other, because the interest of the upper class on the capitalism area trying to modify the will of the government in order to adjust that conduct to their own interest. And we are in this model, at this moment, quite difficult to recognize as a model for the future. Okay, thank you.
I fully agree with what you said. Let me just make a note that I think what will have to happen is that we can't go back to old models, and I think that's as much true of Adam Smith and Hayek as it is of Beveridge and Keynes, and so I think the challenges of the 21st century are very different. First, of course, we have this big climate change issue that we've talked about, and which does animate a lot of young people. And I think that's one very important source for political change, because on climate change, I think, and the policies needed to deal with that at the national and global level, it's possible to hang a vast array of other changes around the market system and the capitalist system in a way that's going to make our societies more equitable, more inclusive, and fairer. That's my reading, for example, of what the Green New Deal discussion in the United States is about. That this is going to be both more effective and politically more successful if it is not viewed simply as a question of the right tax, right price for carbon, but is viewed as a broader set of public policy interventions that deal with labor market insecurities, that deal with inequality, with appropriate technologies and investing in green technologies, alongside with some of the other standard sort of carbon control mechanisms. I think it'll have to look very different from what the 20th century welfare system was, let alone the Manchester liberalism. And I think the future belongs to the political leaders who are able to articulate that narrative, because I do believe that young people are looking for that.
Sorry, Ana Marta. No, it was the Professor Weigel was before, but sorry.
Dr. White.
Dr. White.
Yes.
Herr Doctor.
It's very necessary not to be a professor here. One in this assembly must be not a professor. only two short questions.
The problem is that you speak like a professor, not a doctor.
No, I was a politician and a lawyer. Two short questions. The first, I think, subsidiary is an excellent principle coming from the Vatican. But is it fulfilled in the Catholic Church? And only a short question, do you think there should be more responsibility to the regional conferences of bishops in the world? That is only a question, maybe more to Archbishop Minarati, but maybe. And the other question to Mr. Zuboff, what do you think could be a solution for the conflict in the eastern Ukraine? What do you think could be happened, and what could we do to solve this question, this problem?
I give a short answer. We addressed already the question of subsidiarity in the church. You must never compare the situation in civil society with the situation in the church. Anyway, you say the bishops' conferences. Yes, there is a document published 20 years ago called Apostolos Suos, in which the statute of the bishops' conferences of bishops is developed. And yes, the conferences have some responsibilities, even on doctrinal matters. And the Pope, talking about the reformation of the Curia, has mentioned that the local conferences should have more autonomy. But it makes not much sense for a conference of a little state in Europe to have autonomy. What is important is the union of conferences on a regional level, that means of Europe. And this is going on. I have often been invited to talk to these unions of conferences, which also developed a dialogue with the Orthodox churches in Europe and so on. Because we face on a continental basis the same challenges, secularism and so on. And we have a common culture in Europe, and Northern America, Africa. There are some unions of conferences for each continent. And this is, I think, important for the future, because we have the same faith, but it is lived in different contexts. It's not the same to live in Africa or in Asia or in Europe and so on. And this it is possible to develop this kind of, I do not say autonomy, it means nothing in the Catholic Church, but responsibility for your own affairs, which do not put into danger the unity of the whole. This was your question, I guess. Thank you.
This is an important question, because I think that on 50%, the relations between the European Union and Russia are frozen because of Ukraine and Crimea. We, in our party of People's Freedom, we are sure that it's necessary. For Russia, it's impossible to give any new principles, any new goals in this conflict. The only one what we can do is to return to the status quo ante bellum. It's clear. But practically, as many people in eastern part of Ukraine are of Russian-speaking origin, who supported this secessionist movement, I mean in Donbass and Crimea, afraid now very much of their future, we would ask informally European Union and Parliamentary Assembly of Europe to explain Ukraine that it's necessary to use European principles of national minorities in Ukraine. And we hope that you will do this. And as to Russia, we ought to accept all citizens of eastern Ukraine and Crimea who are afraid to continue to live in Ukraine after the returning of Crimea to Ukraine, and give them, if they want, Russian citizenship, because they supported Putin, but in some ways they supported Russia. So we cannot, we ought to give them the possibility to continue a peaceful life in Russia. But it will be increase of refugees, you see. That's why if Europe help Ukraine to accept this European Convention of Ethnic Minorities, it will be a very good step.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I have Anna Mata, sorry.
Well, I will be very brief. My initial question was prompted by Professor Zubov's talk, but actually the reflection was addressed to everybody of us, no? Because I was reminded of a book by Robert Kagan, who used to be an advisor of President Bush. he wrote a book some years ago with a provoking title of Paradise and Power. And in his view, Europe was paradise. A paradise which was possible because after the Cold War, well, after the Second World War, Europe could rely on the US power in order to defend it from the Soviet Union. Well, I don't share very much this approach because it was a bit cynical. But the comparison is useful for me because it brings to the table the topic of realpolitik and idealpolitik, the problem of power and justice. No? And talking about nations and nation states, we are always talking about ultimately of a balance of powers and the possibility of arriving at practical solutions, but which are fair, just in a way. No? So in this context, the reflection would be, well, how could we expand the paradise to other, because right now we have lost this culture of multinational or multilateral international politics. We are going back to isolationism or bilateralism. It's a very difficult word. So the real problem is how to develop a political culture which is open to global problems and can actually expand the European paradise, because Europe is right now the exception in the world. It's not, and I don't know for how long.
Yes, I think that sure enough that NATO organization is very useful for the peace of Europe. And the NATO organization is the second hand of this Europe without war after the Second World War. You see, one hand is European Union, another, and in some way not less necessary, is NATO. And now when NATO accepted many East European countries, in close perspective all East European countries, we see that this pacification of Europe will be rather stable. The problem is former Soviet Union. As to speak about our party, we incline to be a part, that Russia ought to be a part of NATO also. And this protect Russia from, for example, terrorism and some other. Before Mr. Kwan turned to be a president of China, of course, we're afraid of China, of communist China. It's rather understandable. And on the second hand, it helped to annihilate all these ideas that Russia with China turned to be aggressive totalitarian bloc against democratic Europe. So I think that the time of some unions, not against somebody, but for peace and stability in the region, is not obsolete. So all these unions, European Union and NATO, has its future for our generation, for example. It's my opinion.
I wanted to ask Professor Roderick about the role of civil society in the possible solution of the political trilemma you mentioned. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the works by Günther Teubner on civil constitutionalism instead of political constitutionalism. Because, well, just to mention a book by Günther Teubner, he wrote a book on global law without a state. So the idea is that global civil society organizations can, in the future, so that's the dynamic perspective introduced into the picture, could be more effective in what we could call global governance, not government. So you talked about mainly, well, you talked about global governance regimes, but to me this means government, not governance, in the sense of social governance, social coordination. You talked also about the possible role of social networks and so on. So the question is, there is an argument, a thesis by Günther Teubner that the era of political constitutions is over. Political constitutions were the invention of the 19th century, and we still stick to that kind of constitutions. So in order to solve the political trilemma, and therefore to raise a new way of ruling the world and in a way solving our dilemmas, what could be interesting is to resort to civil constitutions instead of political constitutions. I would like to know your opinion about that. Thanks.
So I'm now moving way beyond my area of expertise, but let me just suggest, I think the mechanism or the arrangements you're suggesting are another alternative to the sort of the global governance by networks, but not through traditional modes of elected representatives, parliaments, and so forth. And that idea also has been around, and it's incorporated in things like the fair trade movement, for example, where you have NGOs pressuring multinational corporations to improve labor standards and things like that through civil society pressure. And I can see how that can occasionally have some positive effect. I think the main problem that I have with a lot of these civil society networks as an alternative form of governance is that I don't think we have a good model of democratic accountability for such organizations. Just to put it very crudely, I'm not so sure as an expert, somebody who works on developing countries, that I'm not quite sure that I'm very happy with the idea of civil society or organizations from the north having a very good idea about what type of labor market institutions are the best for developing countries, and then pressuring corporations to impose those models. It's not that I'm idealistic about the modes of existing, what you call the 19th century model of governments, which don't work at all well in the developing countries. We heard about that in the African context. But at least there I can see a there in terms of I can see what the underlying theory of democratic accountability is. I'm not so sure I see it in the case of civil society organizations, and until somebody, sketches that out for me, I think, I'm not quite sure it is quite the alternative.
Actually, I've got a question for Professor Roderick and then Professor Zubov. Professor Roderick, this is maybe a very naive question, but we talked about global governance is needed for certain kinds of shared goods. But I'm wondering how exactly we define what sort of goods are relevant and which aren't. Take oil. All nations have energy needs, but only some nations have oil, and the fact that they're having oil is due to a kind of geological accident. Norway has tremendous amounts of oil, much more than it needs for its own population. But no one's coming and saying that Norway is obliged to turn its resource into a common resource. Same thing with water. I don't know, Norway has extremely abundant water, but no one's saying that if a day came when there was water shortages other places, it couldn't sell its water. So, but there are other kinds of goods where we think that they are shared. So I don't know if you could just clarify how you draw that line. Then Professor Zubov, my question about Putin, I was coming from the other end. When I asked you the question about the Orthodox Church and Mr. Putin, that I'm not asking whether people in Russia believe that he is sincere in any way in trying to get closer to the Orthodox Church, but it seems clear that President Putin thinks that he's going to get some benefits from the Orthodox Church. Whether he's right about that, one can debate. But so, for instance, one sort of benefit he might get from the Orthodox Church would be, I've heard that there are justifications for the Crimea invasion, the seizure of Crimea, and also some of the activity in eastern Ukraine, that it's done under this old Orthodox idea that Russia has a protector role for the wider Orthodox community. And if we go back to, I talked about the Crusade idea. One of the bases for the Crusade idea was the coming to the aid of co-religionists in the Middle East, right? That can justify certain kinds of intervention. Russian Orthodoxy doesn't have a crusade notion, but it does have the idea of coming this sort of protector role for one's co-religionists within the wider Russian orbit. And so that sort of argumentation could provide Putin with a rationale that might appeal to people of Orthodox faith for some of his initiatives. Is that the case?
I mean, in economics, we tend to distinguish things that grow the size of the pie and things that have to do with the distribution of the pie. And I think the question of what's a private good and what's a public good, or what's a national good versus a regional versus global good, from the perspective of the pie, the size of the pie as a whole, really is a question about whether there are sort of externalities, public good natures. In other words, that things, that if for example, if there's a river basin that's completely within the country, then it's a national good in the sense that, an exploitation by the country of putting a dam or something doesn't have a direct effect on another country except through markets. But if that river basin crosses a border, then it becomes a regional good because, if I put up a dam, upstream and downstream, I affect the amount of water that's gone. Or climate is an extreme case of a global public good. That doesn't mean that we should be insensitive to questions about these natural resources. It's pure luck that Norway and Saudi Arabia have oil and other countries don't. But that's really a question of assigning property rights. And conceptually, it's a different question about whether we think of these as normatively fair or not, that just because those resources are located geographically in one particular part of the world, that we should give full property rights to those nations, or maybe they should be global. But that's a question of assigning property rights. It's not a question about, once you've assigned property rights, whether there should be intergovernmental agreements or not.
The idea of protector of the church, of course, was in Russia during the pre-revolutionary time. But after the communist rule, and you know that in 1917, 1918, we had the church council, Moscow council, a very important council, maybe the only one absolutely free council of Russian church for many, many centuries. And this council decided that Russia may be a republic, may be a monarchy. It depends to their people, and church need no protector except Jesus Christ. And this is the principle of Russian church, that the head of Orthodox Church is not a patriarch. For example, in Catholic Church, you have the head of the church, Pope, yes? But in Orthodox Church, the only head of the church is Jesus Christ himself. And all bishops and patriarchs are only administrators for the church. And emperor, Tsar, also is not a protector of the church. And practically today, we see that both in Ukraine and Belarus, where we have large Orthodox population, people don't want to have any protector both in Mr. Putin or in Mr. Lukashenko. They prefer to live their normal church life. So some people in ideological part of Putin's presidential administration, they try to use this idea of protector of the church, president of Russia as protector of Russian Orthodox Church or Orthodox Church in general, and even some people try to use it during Putin's aggression in Syria. Say that in Syria we have Orthodox population and it is ought to be protected. But these ideas were not popular among Orthodox population.
That's good to hear, but I'll add that some of the admiration for Putin that one finds in very far right-wing circles in Europe and even the US is partly because he's made so much about wanting to protect Christians in the Middle East. Yeah, so you get these sorts of, these sorts of appeals are coming up in some places on the far right spectrum.
But practically, you know that Putin protects only one person in Syria.
Yeah.
And we know the name of this person.
Yes.
Not endorsing the views, I'm just laying it out. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question for doctor or professor or writer, I don't know. No, you. Yeah. You know that the Pope is very concerned about this new form of slaves, human trafficking, in the question of forced labor, in the question of prostitution, forced prostitution, in the question of traffic of organs. And China have, in this point, changed, positive change. What is the awareness? We know that, for example, the German people are very good for climate change. The Spanish is very good for traffic of organs because they have very good idea of donation of organs. What is the awareness of Russia about these great problems? New slave, forced labor, prostitution, traffic of organs. By the way, the Pope speak about this just in the...
Yes. As I know the formal position of Russia, it is of course for these, all these items, for climate control, for other problems you named. But practically, I am afraid that even Russian society in general can't understand the dramatical significance of these items. So it's because we live for so long time in some vacuum and in some, you see, under this iron curtain, and people can't catch these problems. They continue in some way live in another world, in the world of previous decades, what I had explained. But a new generation, students, young intellectuals, of course they live in one wave with Europe, and we hope that in future it will be our mutual problems, and we'll try to solve them together. I think it's high time to finish.